you're looking for that, let me go ahead and record this. So everything's going to be here with what we're working on for today. Are there any questions so far? Again, I know that there were quite a few questions from the Psalm devotion assignment. And for this one, again, for the first time around, I give 100% for doing the assignment. And I'll go ahead and look through it, provide some feedback for you guys. But again, it's a devotion assignment, so there's not necessarily a ton of academic rigor that I'm looking for, as much as it is how much are you interacting both with the Psalm, with the content, how much are you giving in terms of actual interaction between the Psalm and the news story that you're reading through. So the expectations are a little bit different. Are there any questions this far with any of the assignments, specifically the Psalm devotion or anything coming up? So everybody's doing okay with, again, I know again with new assignments, I do offer grace for the first one as we're getting our bearings for these kinds of things. So if you guys do have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Again, if you feel like you're falling behind, do reach out and we'll figure something out. Again, I know it's week 4 and it feels like there's already so much happening. If you have an assignment or two that you need to turn in, please turn them in, even if it's, again, part of an assignment that you invest incredible amounts of time to, and it's only half completed. Again, some points are better than no points, and I tend to be on the side of grace of asking like, hey, is everything okay, if assignments aren't turned in. So I will be going throughout this week specifically to contact you guys, and it's really just seeing how you're doing with classes, how are you doing with my class, how are you doing just life things, again, in a former life, in a past reincarnation. I'm just kidding, I'm not Hindu or Buddhist, but in a past life I was associate pastor, so I still have that bit running through my veins. And so that's part of all it really is just checking to make sure you guys are doing okay, and if there's anything I can do with the class, anything content wise, time management wise, what I can do to help provide any kind of resources that are going to help you to be successful. So are there any questions, comments, concerns, doubts, insecurities, fears?
Yeah, Professor, it's Maria.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of really behind just because I honestly noticed that I was taking your class all late. So I haven't really been on it like I'm supposed to, and I just want to apologize for that. But starting today, I will be on it, and we'll make sure I get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, especially if you're a late ad, I know that things can get kind of crazy. I mean, the good thing is that we haven't had a ton of work that's due. I think that we're like, you count as many assignments on one hand. But what I would do, if you're behind already, what I would do, you work backwards, especially with somebody like me that's giving grace. And there isn't necessarily at this point a penalty for late work. That if you have your assignment that was due today and you didn't do it, do that assignment first and then work backwards. If you just start at week 1 and try to work up to week 2 to try to catch up this week, you're always going to be behind. And so it's better just to start with the most recent assignment that you've missed and then work backwards from there when you do have the time to catch up. So, and that's going to be for most classes that are going to give you grace. That if you do have 1 or 2 assignments that are late, work on the one that was due most recent. And especially if the professors are giving you time to kind of turn in your work whenever you can. Because I know there are other professors aside from me that kind of give you a perpetual grace period to turn things in. So. Yeah, but what it does do is that it affects you and you're able to give more feedback. You're able to get feedback quicker on assignments. And so especially for scripture story number 1, and that's the one I kind of gave a little bit more elaborated feedback that you're going to want to turn that in as soon as you can, if and when you can. So yeah, there's no need to not do work in here, especially if you've seen the quiz. You have an infinite amount of time until the due date. Scripture, story, those ones, there are a couple of questions and you kind of start getting into the motion of what is Partita looking for. And because it's going to go back and forth between the 4 questions, or the 2 questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You said that you, for the first assignment, you gave a little more feedback. so I kind of did my assignments a little late. So how soon do you go back and look at the late assignments to like give
Um,
feedback?
yeah, usually it takes me a week or two to get feedback. But again, because it is a first assignment, I give the most substantial feedback for that. I go through them pretty often. I haven't taken a look um, this last week because it was trying to get you guys the second one back to you guys quicker, but I will be taking a look this week on those first assignments. All right, any other questions? All right, well, if you guys have any questions, either throw it in the chat or send me an email. We meet up. Again, my office hours, Tuesday, Thursdays afternoon on Zoom. So yeah, not terribly difficult to try to walk into an office, a cold office, and stare somebody in the face. So that being said, let me go ahead and I will share this with you all as we get started here this afternoon. And again, you guys are finding this PowerPoint up on Moodle. Sorry, I had a brain fart right now. So you guys will find this up on Moodle. Let me close this out. All right. So scripture as story, as we've been going through, we went through the first two acts. God establishes his kingdom with creation, and that's Genesis 1 and 2. Act 2, rebellion in the kingdom, that is Genesis 3. Right around, we took it up to about 11, right before Genesis 12, where God starts over with Abraham. And I know we went through those two specific acts, Act 2 and part of Act 3, very quickly. Part of it was because of the week that we had off. But again, what Genesis 1 and 2 are trying to help establish for us is God as king in the way that the poetry is expressing itself with these two chapters. Again, which is what makes Act 2 and Genesis 3 makes Genesis 3 again, that's what helps it to frame it for us when we talk about rebellion, when we talk about unfaithfulness, when we talk about covenant later on, which we'll talk about with Act 3, and then we'll talk about even more today. These first two acts, when we frame them in terms of creation, of God both creating humans, God creating people, the same thing, God creating covenant, God creating creation as a whole, that with God creating his interactions with humanity as king in order to establish relationship with them, which again, when we get to start talking about covenant, that these things start to kind of merge together with the themes, and we can start putting the themes together as we start going through the acts. And so going through Act 3, and we'll continue through this, and especially today, we'll start seeing more conflict, as I'm sure you guys saw in your reading. There's going to be more and more conflict that ensues. And so Act 3, the king chooses Israel, redemption's initiated with those two scenes, a people for the king and a land for his people. So let me go ahead and ask you guys a question. You guys either throw it in the chat or just shout it out. Where do we see the story start to unfold between God and the people? Not just God and individuals, but God and a whole group of people.
Was it with Moses
Good.
when he sent?
Good. And there's a phrase that I have brought up that God doesn't just bind himself to an individual like he did with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that he's now bound himself to an entire people, and the people of Israel specifically. And so this is going to be especially important as we talk today about God's interactions between an entire people, because we will see how God's intention in working with people is oftentimes, again, in a group community format, which is going to be very important to remember as we start talking about Judges, that it's not just individuals that are affected by certain patterns and certain behaviors, but how a whole community is disrupted by continual behaviors and continual activities and actions. That entire community is affected by the actions both of individuals and of the collective whole. And so I'll ask some questions a little bit later on about the nature of sin and all those kinds of things. But it's going to be important for us to recognize that it's in that God attaches himself to the group, to the community. And so when the Bible talks about I, it's not just me individual, but I as a collective unit. And so again, I'll go ahead and unpack that when we get there. And so Act 4, the coming of the King, redemption is accomplished. And this is going to be in the Gospels. Act 5, spreading the news of the King. And we'll see if it spreads from Jerusalem, Rome into all the world. And then Act 6, return of the King, redemption accomplished. And again, that we have this timeline helpful for us to see as we're moving along down the line very quickly, but we are moving through it. Last class we talked about Exodus and the desert wanderings. In this class, we'll be actually being able to spend some more time talking and digging through specifically what's happening here in the wanderings and then in the era of the judges. But before we do that, what I do want to give you guys is give you about 10, 15 minutes to talk through that from your Psalm devotional assignment, that how did your reading of the Psalm affect your reading of the news? And how did the time you spent on this, how did the time you spent on the assignment affect you personally? That in what ways are you affected by the reading of the Psalm and the reading by the news? Because again, and I'll talk about it afterwards, but we have this kind of exercise for a reason where you're reading the Bible, you're reading the news, and you're kind of digesting the two together. So I'll go ahead and throw these questions in the chat for you guys to take a look at. But yeah, go ahead and take about, again, 10 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and we'll talk about the Psalm devotional. So. Well, if there's none left, let's go ahead and go through. We'll go through a little bit of numbers, and then we'll go ahead and take a break here pretty soon, probably about 15 minutes. So, as you guys are reading through for today, you guys should have read through a good portion of Numbers, getting through to Judges, which will take us right before the monarchy. And the last place I left off was on Leviticus, which forms somewhat of a segue between what's happening in the Exodus event and what's happening right before the development of the monarchy. Because one of the things we do have to come to terms with, especially in Israel's story, is this idea of wandering in the desert. Because again, the desert and the wilderness oftentimes get depicted as places of judgment, and we'll see why that is today. But it's not that way the whole time. For one, God meets Israel in the wilderness, namely on Sinai, on the side of a mountain, on a cloud, or in a cloud. And so there's something to the wilderness where God takes his people into the wilderness to meet with them there. But then there's also going to be an element, which we'll talk about today, of judgment that happens because of what's going on in Numbers 13 and 14, which again, you'll have answered for your quiz, reading quiz. But as the people are engaging in on their journey out of Egypt towards the promised land, there's a level of optimism that the people have as they're journeying again from the land of oppression, from the house of slavery. The old generation has died off. The people who complained are now starting to complain as they're getting into the wilderness. So a little bit of foreshadowing there, prophetic. But so that first census goes from about 600,000 people up to 2 million people. So it's somewhere between there. That counting of the number of people as numerous as the stars kind of does, again, a little bit of engagement there with Abrahamic covenant, which one of the promises with the covenant is, but shout it out like a Pentecostal, or chat it out on the chat. 15 exclamation points. It's one of the things that Abrahamic covenant promises.
Oh no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. That God will multiply his descendants.
You got it, Brandon. Hey, there you go. I'll send you $1 million right after this. There you go, Caleb. Descendants as numerous as the stars. Again, when we think Abrahamic covenant, you can think 3 P's: pizza, pretzels, partita. I'm just kidding. People, place, presence. People, descendants, place, the land of Canaan, and presence. I will be their God. They will be my people. People, place, presence. When we think Abrahamic covenant. So again, a little bit of a helpful mnemonic device for us to memorize that. And so again, with the people starting to grow more numerous, that there's going to be a kind of optimism that's summed up in Aaron's blessing. Thank you, Carrie Job, for so wonderfully setting it to music for us. Of Yahweh bless you and keep you, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh turn his face towards you and give you peace. And give you peace, or shalom, is remnant, calling back to the Garden of Eden of restored relationship between Yahweh and humanity. Restored relationship between Yahweh and humanity. The shalom, wholeness. Usually we think it's peace, but again, it's a little. It's kind of like when you're translating largely from one language to English. There's some things that get missed, and again with shalom, that's the case as well. That it could indicate health. It can indicate healing, it can indicate wholeness, it can indicate peace, it could indicate well-being. But again, all these things of what is trying to be communicated is trying to remind the people of this restored relationship when the people were when Yahweh was present with the humans in Eden. But again, sadly, like the first couple with Adam and Eve, Israel begins to doubt God's good presence in their life. which starts to become problematic for a couple of reasons. I'll bring this up quickly, but I do need to bring it up. Oftentimes, and I'm not sure if you guys have run into this yet, but I do need to bring it up. For those of you that have heard sermons on Israel's grumbling and complaining in the wilderness. What Israel's complaining in the wilderness, the problem with it isn't, it's not that they're needy. It's not that they're thirsty. It's not that they're hungry. It's not for their lack of faith. If you think if it's just, well, they just need to believe God in terms of like cognitive assent. They just need to think better thoughts, speak more positively, have more faith, be more confident in God's blessings and promises. Like that's all ambiguous, and not just ambiguous, it's all wrong. The issue specifically in Numbers, the grumbling and complaining comes from, and when I say that lack of faith, it means a lack of loyalty to Yahweh, because in essence of what the people are saying is, Yahweh, you suck. Pharaoh was a better king than you. And again, remember the contest in Exodus is over Israel's loyalty. The conflict in Exodus is over Israel's loyalty. The conflict in Exodus is over who will Israel serve, the loyalty. And so by the time the people get out into the wilderness, you start seeing why this is such an issue and why it needs to get dealt with is because of the fact that, again, Yahweh has a rebellion on his hands. And so what does Yahweh do? Graciously, kindly, compassionately hands them over to answer their prayer requests. And so, again, the grumbling and complaining reaches a point in the story, and I'll go ahead and move here, but that, again, even in the tension of the grumbling and complaining, it's important to identify that Yahweh is still answering these people's prayers. When they're hungry, he provides manna. When they're hungry, they want meat, he gives them quail. When they want water, he gives them water. And so again, here the conflict starts to happen because of the fact that, again, these people want to go back to Egypt because God's not trustable. Their thought is that he brought them out to the wilderness to die. Because why? Look, there's nothing out here. Nothing. It's a wasteland. People only come out here to die. And that's exactly what the people think that what God's done to them. So eventually the complaining grows and grows and grows, and the progression from the people now to Miriam and Aaron starts to demonstrate the fact that this thing, this complaining, has now kind of, it's blossomed into something bigger that has reached the leadership of Israel. And so we reach a kind of boiling point when Israel sends spies into the promised land. That what they're meant to do is that they're supposed to have sent a spy to oversee the land of Canaan, to see what the Lord is giving them as a gift. But what they do see there, that yeah, the land's fertile, but then also that the cities are well fortified. And again, the difficulty for that for a nomadic people is the fact that they have simple weaponry. They're not coming in with cannons. They're not coming in well equipped with military power. Mind you, this is a nomadic people, a bunch of shepherds running around. And so to see fortified cities that are well suited for warfare is terrifying for them. And it's because of that the people, there's this phrase that comes out of Numbers 14, I believe, where that we look like grasshoppers to them, and so we were in our own eyes. Grasshoppers, little chiquititos, tiny little things.
Professor,
Yes, talk to me.
is this slides gonna be on Moodle?
Yep, it's on there right now. So if you want to take a look
Okay.
after class.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, the Spanish isn't on there, but the rest of it's on there. And so what happens is that Israel sends spies over to check out the land for 40 days. And then in coming back, They bring back bad reports. And so somebody answer me this question. That why does Israel wander for 40 years in the wilderness? What's the connection?
Because they didn't believe that God would overcome or would help them overcome and take the land.
Yeah, but why 40?
Was it the 40 day that it was something with 40 days?
It's 40 days.
Every day it was a year of, I don't remember fully.
Yeah.
I think
Yep.
based on the reading quiz,
Yep.
it said, if I can remember, one of the answers was they stayed there for 40 years because they wanted to, and they lost faith in God.
That's part of why they're wandering for 40 years. But there's a correlation in the 40 isn't arbitrary. It's not just like, I did the math. There it is. That's what it is. Why 40?
I'm not sure if this is right. I kind of read this somewhere. It was like
What?
40 days is usually how long the season is, I guess you can say. So like 40 days raining, 40 days dry and stuff like that. So I don't know if like that has something to do.
Yeah, not quite close, but not quite.
Did the spies take 40 days to spy on the land, and then was that why?
Well, it definitely has to do with the spies. One more. Yeah, I'll go ahead. Let me go ahead and pull this up so you guys can check it out. Another 12. Lack of faith. Good job, Caleb. So let me go ahead and pull this up for you guys. This is, well, let me go in our SB. I'm gonna stick by my own rules here. All right. So Numbers 14. Yeah, it's down here. So Numbers 14, starting over here at verse 26. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation or generation complain against me? I have heard the complaints of the Israelites, which they complain against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. The Lord answers prayer. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. Your dead body shall fall in this very wilderness, and all of your number included in the census from 20 years old and upward who have complained against me. Not one of you shall come into the land which I swore to settle you, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become booty or would become treasure, that would be taken captive, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have despised. But as for you, your dead body shall fall in the wilderness. The bodies are going to hit the desert floor. And your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. Again, that faithfulness is better tied, again, not so much to cognitive belief, but more towards loyalty. Verse 34, according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, every day a year. You shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely I will do thus to all this wicked generation gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. So I ask you again, what's the connection between 40 days and 40 years of wandering? Because it had come up before that there's a year for every day, but again, what's the specific connection between the two?
It was for the every 40 days that they spent spying on the land that the Lord, for every day it was a year, correct?
Yep. Every day that they came back with a negative report that caused the people to freak out, that ends up getting them a year of wandering. And in reality, what it's meant to do is it's meant to kill off the old unbelieving or unloyal, disloyal generation. And so again, it kind of serves this dual purpose, which again, it's to purge the camp from those who would be disloyal, but then also it's a year for every day of this negative report. So when Bible trivia rolls around, you will be dominating the game if you give that answer. So, and that's why we're all here, right? We're all here to rack up those Bible trivia points. So that being said, what happens is that with the way numbers ends up rounding itself out is that the people will end up dying in the wilderness, which brings up this episode between Balak and Balaam. And I'm not going to go too much into detail because we do this in Pentateuch, but the point between Balak and Balaam is that even after this generation having been killed off for their disbelief or for their lack of faith or the lack of loyalty, that God is still present with the people in this threefold blessing that that is pronounced upon Israel. That Balaam pronounces this blessing in order to communicate that God indeed is still present with Israel despite their disloyalty, which again sets the scene for Deuteronomy, because what Deuteronomy is going to do is establish a second covenant between God and Israel. Let me do this for you guys. So Deutero means second, and that's in Greek. Nami, which is actually namos, equals law. And that's in Greek as well. So kind of the second giving of the law or second giving of Torah between God and his people. That there's this hope that for this new generation that having seen what they saw in Exodus, having seen what they saw to their parents, that there's going to be this new possibility, this new potentiality for entering into the promised land that God's desiring to give them, and then bring about, again, the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham of giving his people a land. And so John Goldingay has this great quote that more clearly than any other part of the Bible, Deuteronomy portrays the relationship between God and his people in the light of the relationship between a great king and his subject peoples. Again, we can't lose sight of the fact that God as king and his interactions with his people is as one between a king and his subjects or the vassals. And so we see why rebellion and disloyalty starts factoring tremendously into the story. And so the way Deuteronomy is going to be framed is as these kind of 5 sermons, that it's a reminder of the past relationship and how God has been present with the people in the present generation, of the mistakes of their parents, again, in terms, again, not just of not believing rightly or not believing enough. It is framed in terms of loyalty and disloyalty, covenant faithfulness or covenant disloyalty or breaking covenant, which then prompts the attitude that God then requires of his people, that love isn't just something that's cast for the New Testament, but here, again, with the way that love is being framed, it's not just taken as romantic love between two partners, two people getting ready to date, get married, have 2.5 kids, white picket fence. That again has very little to do with romance and everything to do with commitment and faithfulness and single-hearted devotion and loyalty. Which just in general, that might be the better definition for love than anything else. Especially when a Jewish rabbi much later on comes around and says that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Not that if you love me, you'll sacrifice your family, give up everything, give up all your time in a really toxic manner and tell everybody how wrong they are. But know that if you love the Lord, to love the Lord your God, that it's connected to keeping Torah. It's connected not necessarily with performance as much as it is a faithful response to what God's already done, which is why that reminder of past relationship is so powerful. Because God's already acted and now it's calling the people to respond. And so then Yahweh is going to dictate the specific requirements of keeping Torah. The Yahweh's lordship will affect every part of community life, that there's no place where this covenant does not reach. That God's lordship, God's kingship, being charged over the people, rules and dictates every part of their life. That if you want to put it this way, Yahweh is Lord. And it's because of that that every area of life is affected. So then you have the consequences that follow these blessings and curses, which again serve as encouragement towards faithfulness to keeping covenant. And then you have Moses' last words. And sadly enough for Moses, for breaking covenant and for disobedience, that Moses too is unable to see the promised land. And so then in conclusion, so in Numbers, we see God's people complain and struggle to have faith in him despite his presence in their midst in the tabernacle. Mind you, it's not just God far off, answering every once in a while when we have just the right coffee and the right music playing in the background, but that God is traveling with them right in the middle of the camp. But this still doesn't produce the kind of trust, the kind of loyalty that is going to get the people into the promised land. In Deuteronomy, we see God renew the covenant with the people. And mind you, God doesn't have to do this, but he chooses to do so because of his faithfulness and desire to be committed to relationship and both fulfilling his plan and promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Which is why that threefold name, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God's, again, committing himself to a very specific covenant. And so as they sit outside the land, the people will then discover and learn how in this place, that how are they going to reflect God in the way that they establish their laws, their customs, their economics, and their politics. Everything that they do meant to serve as a reflection of who God is. Everything that they do is meant to be a reflection of who God is. And I can't say that and stress that enough, that in everything that they do, their participation within social life, their politics, their economics, the laws, everything, the way everything is set up, that it's meant to reflect God in order that Israel might be a light to the nations. And that in being a light, that people would be drawn to them. And so are there any questions, comments, concerns thus far? Other than when are we taking a break, because we're about to take one right now. All right, well, if there's no questions, let's go ahead and take 15 minutes. So come back at 3:10, 3:11. Other than what song was that? All right. Well, let's go ahead and we'll keep it moving here. So back to the PowerPoint. So you'll see here as we get started is the slide right after break. You'll see here in one of the slides, you may be wondering what that is. And if you do take notice, some of the places here, you'll see Ramses, number 1, Sukkoth, which again here in Upper Egypt. And I'm so sad we can't be in class so I can hear all your guys' laughter at all my Nacho Libre references every time I say Ramses. Sukkoth here. And there's 2 possibilities for Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula here, just outside of Egypt, between Egypt and Israel, or land of Canaan at this point, because there's no Israel quite yet. And one of them is that it's down here in this area, here in the bottom of the peninsula in the south, or somewhere up north. Again, that there's not necessarily a complete answer on where this is, but scholars guess it's in one of these 2 points. So you notice that regardless of the route that you go on, the people end up kind of taking this circular route here. What is happening here, that's where the people are wandering, in this little area right here, right outside of Canaan. It should have taken about 3 months to get there, but instead they take 40 years. It should have taken 3 months, but instead it takes 40 years. It should have taken 3 months, but again, it takes 40 years because of their disloyalty or rebellion. And so you can see here right after the wandering around in a circle, not really circle, kind of more like a triangle, they move on. And when they move forward, they go from Dibon over to Avel Shittim, right outside of Jericho on the other side of the Jordan, which takes us over to Joshua. And again, after the wanderings, they land over here at Avel Shittim. And then they begin to move westward into the land of Canaan. And you guys will see again here from the little infographic here of different chapters that mark Israel's conquest in the land of Canaan. And so you'll see here that Israel starts out on the eastern bank of the Jordan. This is a huge step for this former nation of servants or slaves that were in the land of Egypt, to now be going on a conquest for a land that is their own. And this, the project of taking over the land was seen as entirely dependent on Yahweh providing for their success, that the land is meant to be a gift for and to the people. That the land is seen as a gift for and to the people, but yet the people are having to go into the land to take it. And so it's here that we start to see, again, that threefold promise to Abraham, the promise of a place for the people, the promise of both people, descendants, and then God's presence being present with the people in the land. And so again, this promise, the Abrahamic covenant of God bringing Abraham's descendants into the land of Canaan, was thought to be fulfilled at that point, or is fulfilled at this point. Let me correct myself. It is fulfilled at this point. And so the challenge, Joshua, was to prepare the people, again, this new generation that had just received the second Torah, the second teaching, second law, after the first generation had died out. And his first encouragement to the people was to be strong and courageous, for the Lord their God is with them. Yahweh their God is with them. And because Yahweh is on their side, that this guaranteed victory. And because Yahweh is with them, this guaranteed victory. And so let me go to this real quick. I do need to kind of go on a little bit of a rant, but I promise that there's meat on the bone of this rabbit if we chase it into the trail. All right. So let me go ahead and make some. Adjustments here. Joshua chapter 1. We'll start at verse 2. My servant Moses is dead. This is Yahweh talking, speaking to Joshua, son of Nun. That Moses, my servant, is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. In other words, I will not leave you or forsake you. It sounds a lot like somebody else in the New Testament. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Covenant language. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law, then all the teaching, all the Torah that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it right or to the left, that you may succeed or may be successful wherever you go. This book of Torah, this book of teaching shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. That is in reference to Torah. So then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Again, this passage specifically, that if you spend any number of months, even years in church, you will have heard this passage being talked about the Bible as a whole, but specific to what's happening here in Joshua. It's in reference to keeping Torah. Because mind you, what had just happened a couple books ago in Numbers, where the people do not keep covenant, they do not keep Torah, they break it through their grumbling, through their complaining, through their disloyalty. And so this reinforced encouragement for the people to keep Torah, again, is on the heels of this massive failure by the first generation. It's not just talking about the Bible in general, it's talking again about Mosaic covenant, Torah, more generally. And so what happens in Numbers is it starts out that you have spies. There should be Joshua 2, not Numbers. Joshua 2, that Rahab, who's a prostitute, will harbor some spies. And even to Canaan, Yahweh's famous spread, which again is in contrast with what's going on in Numbers. Whereas the people are growing more hopeless, in Joshua they grow a little more confident. And you kind of see the start of the spread towards other people, specifically those that are inhabiting Canaan. That what you see is these vassals in military service of their suzerain. And what that means is that you see a people in military service to their king. Very common in the ancient Near East. Very, very common in the ancient Near East, and still pretty common here today. We have in some countries, like Korea, where everybody enlists and participates in active military service. And so this is the same, again, for what's happening in Israel, where the men are enlisted in military service to Yahweh, who is the king. And so one of the ways that Joshua is trying to depict what's happening here is that Yahweh is coming into a land infested with foreign deities. And so much like how he did in Egypt, he's now going to come into Canaan to take over. The Yahweh will be the local deity in Canaan. And those of you that are in cultures right now, let me see either see some hands, some faces, thumbs up, whatever it might be. Who's in cultures right now? Not everybody at once. All right. Well, if you're not in cultures right now, you will be very soon. Because yeah, that's something you guys will be talking about pretty soon, with local deities and how to each kind of each region had its local god or local deity that was the god for that specific area. And you could think like in Greek mythology, how there were deities of the water. There was one for the air. There's one for war. There's one for fertility. There's one for the moon. There's one for death. There's gods everywhere. And so it was much the same thought that it was Yahweh who was coming into this land to be the deity supreme in this area. And so what I want you guys to do, you know, there's something else that I want you guys to talk about. So we'll go ahead and skip over this part specifically, but the contrast between what we see in Joshua 6 and Joshua 7 provides for us is that the land was a gift to the people, but it's also a gift that the people have to work in cooperation with God with. That it's not just the land that the people are supposed to take over on their own, and it's not just a gift that that the people don't have to do anything with or about, but that it involves and includes the people's participation in receiving the land. And so again, what does it tell us about what is most important in the narrative and in Israel receiving the promised land from Israel? That Israel's obedience is tied to their receiving the promised land, that Israel's obedience is tied to their receiving of the promised land, that Israel's obedience is tied to their receiving of the promised land. And so again, in being faithful, in being loyal to Yahweh, that's how they were going to receive the land. It wasn't just in naming and claiming. It wasn't just sitting on their hands. It wasn't just in praying and fasting all day. But again, in working in cooperative obedience with Yahweh, that the people were going to take the land. And so what does Joshua do? After coming to the land, he will renew the covenant. And so again, written on stone so they clearly understand what may await them. And again, the Yahweh gives Israel the land in order for Israel to be a light to the other nations. And this is specifically done in the way that they treat one another. That how Israel is a light is in the way that they set up their politics, in the way that they set up their economics, in the way that they set up their social customs, in the way that they offer forgiveness of debts. Again, it's in the ways in which they treat each other and establish their social order that other nations were to know that there is a God in Israel. And so Israel is supposed to wipe out other tribes that they meet. And so this provides, for some, a very distasteful part of the Bible. But it's what we have. It's one of the war texts that we have in the Bible. We have to, again, we're dealing with an ancient people. And so what happens there in Joshua, that there's this treaty with the Gibeonites, which may indicate that there may be some trouble afoot for the peoples, specifically in regards to foreign worship, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes here. And so what Joshua does, distributes the land. Joshua distributes the land. So just like an Oprah special, what he does is have everybody look under their seats and starts yelling, "You get some land, you get some land, you get some land." Pointing at people in the congregation. And so what he establishes are these cities of refuge, that it's a different way of dealing with violence and injustice. And mind you, what these cities of refuge are meant to do is both to give space between victim and perpetrator, but then also act as the means to try to reconcile injustice in the community. It's a means to reconcile within the community, to provide these cities of refuge. So has anybody seen John Wick? Yeah? Yeah, me and my wife just saw it. We saw it this weekend. And for those of you that have seen it or may not have seen it, you know how they have that hotel where there's supposed to be no business done there, and then they end up breaking the rules? That's what cities of refuge are meant to be like. If you haven't seen John Wick, as a brother in Christ, I'm not supposed to recommend it, but if you just so happen to watch it, you may or may not be entertained. I'll tell you that much. And so yeah, that being said, it's one of those things where the cities of refuge were meant to kind of be an alternative space from what was happening in the world, specifically in regards to how justice was dealt with and how it was accomplished. And so you have, with the distribution of lands, you have two tribes, the Levites and the two tribes with Joseph. And mind you, the Levites don't have their own land. And this is going to be important, especially, we don't necessarily talk about it in this class, but considering a lot of you may or may not have heard tithes and offerings. Tithes were originally meant to support those without land. And why that's important is because the land was meant to produce olives, produce fruit, produce food, give you grazing land for your animals. You have land where you access water and wells and different sorts. And so what the tithe was meant to do was to support those who didn't have any land, to support the economically disadvantaged. And so you kind of start seeing the ways in which it's meant to start working itself out, with the establishment of this different kind of community. And so it's at the end of Joshua that we see this promise fulfilled, that you see the people, place, and presence all finally brought together, that the promise given to Abraham, despite Pharaoh, despite what happens in the wilderness, finally God and the people are united in the land that God promised Abraham so many moons ago. That Moses' purpose of leading the people into the promised land is now completed, even though he doesn't get to see it happen. That Israel is in a land, and being in the land is meant to be a taste of what God intends for his whole creation. That Israel's being in the land is meant to be a foretaste or a kind of taste of what God intends for all of creation to thrive. And again, to live in that kind of shalom, that wholeness, that is the original intention from way back in Genesis 1 and 2 of God being present with the peoples. And so the Israelite future is based on the remembrance of Yahweh had done specifically in the Exodus event, and then responding faithfully to Yahweh, which is demonstrated in covenant keeping. So remembrance and faithful response, remembrance and faithful response, remembrance and faithful response. That was the way that the people were to secure a future within the land. And again, that there's this repeated theme that the people's faithfulness or obedience will keep them in the land, while disobedience or disloyalty will keep them from inhabiting the land. And this is going to be especially true when we get to exile, which I need you guys to keep in mind as well. That the people's occupation of the territory is premised on their obedience and faithfulness to Torah, to covenant. That the people staying, inhabiting, living in, on the land, reaping its benefits, its fruitfulness, is all premised, based on, founded on their keeping of covenant, keeping of Torah. And so to read this quote here for you, that during Joshua's life, people do keep the covenant, but their future in the land now given them will depend on how they choose to live after Joshua's death. In his farewell speech to the leaders of Israel, Joshua reminds them that the land is a gift from Yahweh and that their future well-being depends on how they love and obey him, that is Yahweh. Joshua reminds them that the land is a gift. That the land is a gift. And that their future well-being depends on how they love and obey him. There's no thought that love and obedience are two different things. That to love is to obey and to obey is to love. In terms of covenant keeping. And so as we go over to the book of Judges, we may have gotten the idea from Joshua that the conquest was 100% successful, that the people absolutely just kicked the snot out of everybody in the land of Canaan. But Judges 1 doesn't indicate that so much. And so let me go ahead and share this with you guys so you guys can get an idea and you guys can see it. So I won't go through the whole thing. But you can see here at verse 27, this is chapter 1 of Judges, that Manasseh didn't drive out all the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor, inhabitants of Ivlim or its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. Heads up, this is where we get the word Armageddon for Megiddo. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor or the inhabitants of Nahalol. Asher didn't drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sion, or Alab, or Aksib, or Helba, or Aphek, or Rehov. And Naphtali didn't drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. And this is going to be important to look at. And the Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country. They did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites continue to live in Ha-Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shalabim. But the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim and from Selah and upwards. So we find that the conquest wasn't as complete as Joshua tries to paint it. And the reason for that is because part of it seems to be that they're more they're more technologically sophisticated. But they're stronger than some of the Israelites were. And mind you, they also, Joshua also creates treaties with the Gibeonites, which they weren't supposed to do. And so in Judges 2, Yahweh takes the Hebrews, Israelites, to court. And so what Yahweh's judgment is that Yahweh will no longer drive out the remaining peoples from them, but the way that they are described is that there will be a thorn in the Israelites' side, that the people will be a thorn in the Israelites' side, the people will be a thorn in the Israelites' side. So are there any questions, comments, concerns this far? All right, so what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead. We're going to take a look at this next question here. What I want you guys to do is take a look at Judges 1 through 5, and you can briefly look it over, but you were to have read it for today. And so this shouldn't be too much of a task. We're looking it over. Why are the Israelites conquered and oppressed after Joshua? And what pattern do we find within this Judges narrative? What's the reason why they're always oppressed and find themselves in trouble? And what is the reason? And is there a kind of pattern that we're starting to see with and among the people? Again, I'll post this to the chat so you guys can take a look. I'll give you guys about, let's wait for the thing. I'll give you guys about 7 minutes to talk about it. And again, this should be fresh on your minds, the assignments from today, or in some of the readings. Why are the Israelites conquered and oppressed after Joshua? Why are the Israelites conquered and oppressed after Joshua? They worship Baal. Good. And who's Baal? Or Baal, however you want to say it. False god. Good. Good. And what's the big deal about about their worship of a false god?
Didn't it break the covenant that they made with God?
Mm-hmm. Good. Good, Denny. Yeah. The part of what the covenant obligations demanded was, again, when we talked about love, that it's single-hearted devotion or loyalty. And so what worship ends up doing is, again, it's divided loyalty. Yeah, they weren't supposed to do it in anger to God. Good. Thou shalt not have any gods. Good. And that's the very first one. The first word, or the first saying that God gives to Israel is, thou shalt not, you won't have any other gods before me. Again, that single-hearted loyalty or devotion that was demonstrated through covenant obedience. And that's already out the door. Already out the door in Judges. But what pattern do we find in Judges as well? You can give me like a broad sketch of what happened.
Where like they sin, and then they were held captive under another people, and then they would cry out, and then God set them free, and then they would just keep repeating.
Mm-hmm. All right, good, and that's essentially what happens. And so, again, for the sake of time, what we'll do, what occurs is that Baal worship takes place, which, mind you, Baal's place or Baal's place among the deities, the local deities, first it's a Canaanite deity. And again, we talked about with local deities that there were certain gods that belonged to certain regions, which is why you'll have in different places, you'll have like Ashtoreth, you have Molech, again, that these local deities, one for the Amorites, one for the Ammonites, that for these different regions, different peoples, that they have their own God. But again, for the land of Canaan, the local deity was Baal, and that specific deity was represented by a calf who was also the god of fertility. And so to engage in worship of this deity was to try to procure or to try to secure fertility in the land and to cause it to produce, which again, if you are a nomadic agricultural people, you need the land to be productive. And again, considering, you kind of think of, if like with the drought that we had in California, that if you don't have serious irrigation systems, then there's going to be problems. And even with the irrigation systems that we do have here in California, that there's still issues if it doesn't rain. And so there's a stated desire to want to appease the local deity in order to ensure that your family would survive, that you would survive, that your kids would survive, that your people are going to make it in this new land. And so again, in as much as we want to say how much of an idiot these people are, or how big of idiots the people are, again, that the worship of a different God isn't just for, they just got bored and had nothing to do at home, but rather to try to procure the favor of a certain deity, which ends up getting them into more trouble than maybe that is worth, because this launches them into what we call sin cycle. What happens is that the Israelites become unfaithful to God. And again, we understand that through idol worship, idolatry in a single word. The God is angry with them and allows them to become oppressed by their enemies. In response to their pleas for help, God will raise up a judge or deliverer to defeat their enemies. In the land, the people have rest until Israel rebels against God again. And so again, this is a cyclical pattern that the people find themselves in over and over and over again, that these are people that have a real difficult time, again, with their loyalty to Yahweh. In a lot of ways, they're a lot like us. That it's difficult. That we too are a land littered with different gods. Whether it be consumerism, whether it be even something like the American dream, nationalism, racism, that we have gods in our land as well. They might be more subtle. It might not just be a giant statue of gold, but yeah, we've got different things that are pulling towards our affection, that are demanding our attention, that are demanding our loyalty. Otherwise, we might be left out in the cold, left out in God's hands, which again is for us as God's people, that's what we're called to do. But at the same time, there still exists the temptation for us to rescind our loyalties to serve another. And so there's a little, this beautifully painted picture that I put together for you all, sketched it by hand. And you kind of see the cycle. It starts here. I'll go ahead and number them for you guys so you guys can kind of get an idea of where's it going. And it starts right back over again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Israelites become unfaithful. God allows them to become oppressed. God answered their pleas for help once they start crying out, and the land's going to have rest until Israel rebels against God again. And again, the rebellion language is very much purposeful because you have God's people rebelling against him, the king. Is that making sense? Any questions, comments, concerns about that so far? Thoughts, ideas, realizations, epiphanies? All right. Well, I really did hope I explained it that well, that there aren't that many questions there. But if you do, speak now, forever hold your peace. Forever. Don't ever ask me a question about the Bible again. Just messing with you guys. Yeah, again, I do want to bring this up because, again, it's a cyclical pattern that the effects of what we see happening in Genesis 3 isn't necessarily done away with, despite the fact that God's made several covenants. God showed up. God's talked in a cloud. God's taken them out of a land of oppression. God's provided for their needs in the middle of the wilderness. God's given them a land. But yet at the same time, when God's done all these different things, it still hasn't produced faithfulness in the people. It hasn't caused the people to respond in consistent faithfulness. And so there's still persistent issues that demonstrate themselves despite what God is continuing to work out and to work towards, which again will only bring up the necessity later on for quite possibly a different route, as we saw God take in Genesis 6. And so in Judges, as God sending these individuals to be redeemers of Israel, you have Othniel, Caleb's younger brother, serves as a judge. Deborah, who serves as a judge. Gideon, who serves as a judge. You have these stories of Israelite oppression and the violence they have to commit them to get themselves out of it. That again, the original intent and the original vision is not of violence, but rather the people dwelling in peace with one another and being a light to the nations, and God dwelling with the people. Yet because of specific human actions, that violence comes about in light of the kind of chaos again. The Yahweh's present right there with the people. But it's not like how it is in Exodus or even in Joshua, where God's right there talking to Joshua. It is messy. It's messy. It's messy. It's messy. Because again, the back and forth action that God has with his people. And it's not just a sin cycle and they're kind of like circular, but rather it's a spiral downwards, and it's kind of hard to see because of whatever's going on with this virtual background thing. But just kind of think of a spiral going downwards. And that nobody embodies more of this downward spiral more than our boy Samson. That Samson, who's a Nazarite, has specific prohibitions, that he's not supposed to dabble in fertility, with fertility gods. Again, which is funny because of what ends up being his vice, which is the ladies. He's not supposed to tap into magic, which again, it doesn't mean he's not supposed to do card tricks or pull a coin out of somebody's ear, but rather that he's not supposed to harness the power of the divine for his own purposes, which again, that's the original intent of magic, to harness the power of the divine for selfish purposes. Not to participate in the cult of the dead. And that these are things that all Israelites should avoid, really, in actuality. But what Samson will do is that his own set apartness, like his own distinction in the midst of all these people, are supposed to symbolize Israel's differentness among the nations and everything that they go about doing and not doing. That Samson is distinct not just in the way that he goes about his the differentness in the way of what he's supposed to do and not do. He's also very much politically successful, militarily successful, due to the strength that he draws from his beautiful mane, his hair. However, his personal life is a steaming hot mess. Marries a Philistine, who's a foreign woman, precious Delilah. Visit prostitutes. Then it goes again. In the Delilah episode, the Delilah, what we could say is double crossing him, rather Samson's own covenant disobedience, seals his fate. Again, you have this individual, their inability or unwillingness to stay loyal, despite manifested demonstration of God's presence with them. Because you will see on more than one occasion, despite Samson's personal life, that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson and helps him to accomplish great military feats. Which ultimately goes on, and this is a separate point, but that there is no that gifting is no substitute for character. Gifting is no substitute for character. Just look at Samson. Personal life a hot mess, but he's out there doing the thing. He's out there fighting. He's winning. But what ends up doing him in again are all the issues in his personal life that end up coming back to bite him in the butt. So there is no, again, gifting is no substitute for character. What does Delilah do? She cuts off Samson's hair, the source of his strength. Philistines gouge his eyes out, throw him in prison. And so Samson and Israel's fate are intertwined in as much as they share a lot of similarities with the way that they're distinct or the way that they're called to be holy. But in the midst of this context where you have Samson being conquered, that there's this thought that now Dagon, again, who's the god of the Philistines, has now achieved victory over Yahweh. That Dagon, god of the Philistines, has achieved victory over Yahweh. And so, in a sad, tragic fashion, that it's in Samson's death that he kills more than when he lives. And so we're brought into this paradox that when Samson dies, Israel does not, but nor is she delivered. She's back at square one. Back at square one. That they're no better off for Samson than they did when he came back on the scene. And so let me pose this question to you all. Let's say you're in charge. We'll just open this up for discussion. Let's say you're in charge of trying to solve this problem for Israel. People are unfaithful. Everybody's running amok. Your last leader that you had, he had a bunch of personal issues, a lot of problems. But if you had to fix the problems, what would you do? Caleb said, repent. Well, that's a start. That's definitely a start. What else might you do? What do the people need? What are you thinking of the people? What's the source of the problem? How are you going to address the solution? How are you going to create a solution in diagnosing the problem?
Wouldn't it be a bit difficult since like they don't see their own problem, like they keep on getting saved and God like helps them, but then they go back into doing the same thing. So like I'd say first help them realize as a whole like the main issue of what they're doing and being in that cycle.
Yeah. But let's say you were able to help the people recognize, okay, you know what? We got this idol issue. How do you solve that issue? How do you go about solving that problem that seems to plague the people over and over and over and over and over and over again? Lay out simple actions and steps to take. Well, give me one of them. Give me the first one. What's the first step?
For me, it's really just obedience.
Obedience. Okay, that's the first step.
You need a strong leader like Moses who can lead the people, or Joshua,
Strong leader.
who is like constantly communicating with God.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to set like a good example for like a lot of these problems in these stories is that like the first generation does it right, but then the next generation kind of like messes up again. So if you set that example engrave into the next generation's heads not to do that kind of stuff, it might not happen again, you know. So like good teachings and like Caleb said, a good leader, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else?
I think maybe like grow
Yeah.
the people to fear the Lord more. Because like the lack of the fear is what causes really disobedience. So yeah.
Yeah. Good. Well, Judges is trying to figure it out just much like we are. That in trying to figure it out, what Judges is trying to get across to us in a lot of ways is trying to tell us what the people need. And it's been brought up before a couple times. That what the people need is something, somebody, and their response is in some ways to try to say, we need a king, like all the other people. Because there's a specific mention in Judges, it happens on more than one occasion, that in those days there was no king in Israel. That for the problem of Judges, what they would say that is the problem beyond an idol issue is that there's a monarchy issue. There's a leader issue. That there's no king in Israel. So because there's no king, each person is going to do what they thought to be right in their, other texts will say, be right in their own eyes. And I had brought this up a few weeks ago and made mention of is that do pay attention to eyes because it comes up here. That part of the issues of what people see, and it's part of the way that the Bible communicates of not just in one's own eyes, like literal eyes, but according to one's own thinking. And so again, it's not just a cognitive problem. It's not just a thought problem. There's something going on with loyalty. But again, what Judges is trying to communicate is that there is a problem that goes back to not having a king, which leads to the Danites. They sack Laish. They slaughter residents. You have gang rape and a gruesome murder. Body being chopped up into 12 pieces and sent out to the nation of Israel, to each clan. Then you have a civil war that divides Israel. So whereas Israel starts out inheriting the land, about to live gloriously in the land in which God's provided, ends up with Israel fighting with herself. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring this part up, is that both female figures both open and close the book of Judges, and it frames it. But however, in other parts of the Bible, that ladies are often forgotten, and you'll see that there in 1 Samuel 12, as they're recalling the judges. No mention of Deborah. No mention of Jael. And even in Hebrews 11, over in the New Testament, you have a mention of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, but again, no mention of Jael, no mention of Deborah. And specifically in Judges, the fate of women, that women often suffer the most atrocious violence within Judges, and the whole of the Bible even. While at the same time being victims of violence, they are also some of Israel's greatest saviors. That the biblical text, written in a patriarchal culture, not only do they prove to be some of Israel's greatest leaders, that they are often independent agents acting on their own, that they don't answer or need any kind of man to dictate to them what they need to be doing, what they ought to be doing. And mind you, it's women that prove more loyal than men. That it's Gideon who needs the fleece. It's Barak who needs his sister Deborah. It's Samson who continues to get himself in trouble again and again and again. And so again, it's always the women that prove themselves more faithful than the men do. Which I'm of the sort of thinking that's still true. That's still true. My wife's much better follower of Jesus than I am. More sensitive to the Spirit. More brave, more bold. More willing to confront things. And so maybe in all this chaos, with the lack of a king or authority figure, maybe what Judge is trying to get across to us, that maybe what in reality of maybe what is needed is rather a queen, because again, that there's a thought that there's a need for a king or some kind of authoritative ruler when the people might be best served by being led by a woman. Because again, women in the text prove to be more faithful, more stable. So, again, just some thoughts that maybe it's best not to put a man in charge, especially when they tend to cause the most chaos in Judges. And in the end, isn't Yahweh supposed to be the king already? And again, that's going to be important to remember as we're talking through monarchy for next week and the ways that the prophets function in conjunction with the monarchy as well. Of who is actually reigning, who is actually ruling, and who's supposed to be the one calling the shots. Because yeah, the kings will start the monarchy will start to get it twisted. Because of that, they'll start to cause some troubles. All right, are there any questions, comments, concerns, regrets?
Are there any homework assignments that aren't going to be posted onto the calendar this week?
Let me go ahead and open that up for you guys to check it out. I should have opened it up for next week, but let me check. There's going to be some weeks that are lighter than others. I know that off the top of my head. And yeah, they're already on there. It's just the Psalm devotion and the reading quiz that was for today. But for next week, let me go ahead and I'll go ahead and open this up for you guys to see. Show topic. All right, and if you guys refresh week 5, you guys should be able to see it. There's just the 2 scriptures of story for next week. And you'll see for scripture story number 5, it'll say Judges and Solomon, but I'm going to change them out right after class. It should be David and Solomon, and I'll switch that up right now. Or right after class. All right, does that answer your question, Charles?
Yes, thank you.
Sweet. Any thoughts? Questions? All right, well, if there are no questions, you guys have a great rest of your week. Again, my office hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 4. Reach out, holler at your boy if you guys need anything. See you guys.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your week.
That's it.
Wait, can I actually talk to you for a bit after class?
Of course. Of course.
I actually have a question too.
Okay.
Profession.
Yeah.
I just want to tell you that I had trouble turning in the homework, but I'll get it in as soon as possible.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, what I'm gonna do for Joseph and then Farrakh, I'm gonna go send you guys to the waiting room, and then I'll pull you guys in when I'm done, like talking to the next person. Is that okay? Okay, cool.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so Caesar had let me know first. I'll go ahead and meet with them first. But yeah, I'll go ahead and pull you guys in when we're good.
All right, thank you.
All right, of course. See you guys. All right, there you go. All right, everything all right?